Nation state Bitcoin adoption. That's the business. That is your business. What a fun business to invest in, and what a fun business to run. I have to start in El Salvador, but just really quick, high level from El Salvador to here, I know there's a lot you can't talk about. We can't even go to the website without a password. But whatever you can say about nation state adoption.
It's what we're known for. So oftentimes people say Jan3 is a nation state Bitcoin company, and people reach out to us because we've done a lot of work in the space. So it's definitely an interesting position to have. And it's also an important thing to push forward as well, because I can see if there are not more countries that adopt Bitcoin, if El Salvador is the only one, then there's a risk that it could stop because the organizations that be, the, the IMFs and World Banks, they could exert a lot of pressure. But if you get more countries to adopt a Bitcoin standard, then El Salvador is not alone. So there will be allies, Bitcoin allies for these countries. And I guess that is really our goal, to make sure that the Bitcoin adoption movement keeps on gaining momentum. We've had countries, but we've had cities and autonomous regions declare Bitcoin adoption, which is quite meaningful in my view, because it's not every country that will be able to adopt the Bitcoin standard. El Salvador is a bit of an outlier in that sense because the president was a Bitcoiner before he became the president. So you have an advantage there. Whereas in other places, they might be learning about Bitcoin for the first time. So you have a larger battle to push Bitcoin through. And also, the dynamic of government in El Salvador is that they have a majority of Congress, so they can pass these laws without an opposition party putting a stop on that, which is the case for a lot of governments. So that makes El Salvador very special, and it allowed them to adopt it very quickly. Other countries, I think, will come around in the next 5 years, but it is a longer battle. And that's also why these cities that adopt Bitcoin and autonomous regions that say they want to adopt a Bitcoin strategy are very interesting because they are more agile, more nimble, and they can move a lot more quickly. One example is Prospera in Honduras. It's a special economic zone, and they have made Bitcoin legal tender. And we announced that in Miami a couple of years ago. And then you have Madeira, which is an autonomous region of Portugal that's said that they are working towards adopting Bitcoin. But they're still part of the EU in Portugal, so they can't just make Bitcoin legal tender. But they're working on pushing for Bitcoin adoption. So that's like a little foothold in the EU. Then in Switzerland, you have Lugano, where Paulo Arduino and Tether guys and Bitfinex guys are working with the city for onboarding a ton of merchants so you can spend Bitcoin and Tether everywhere in the city. So there is already a lot of movement, and you have at the same time elections all over the world, specifically in North America and South America in the next 5 years, where you're going to see a lot of turnover. And Bitcoin is becoming a key part of political discourse in these regions. So you have Argentina with Javier Milei, who has talked about Bitcoin quite often, and other countries in that region too have Bitcoin friendly candidates as well. So I can just see the next 5 years being very pivotal in terms of Bitcoin adoption around the world.
So a big part of Jan 3 is coming off the heels of advising Bukele and being a big part, an architect of the bonds out there with the Bitcoin City, your role in that. What's that like now? What is the temperature like with that now? How involved are you in that project?
I helped them design the Bitcoin bond offering back in the day when I was still at Blockstream. And then, of course, as we announced it at the Bitcoin City debut, and you were there, right? And they've done a number of things to pave the way for this. One of those being the digital securities laws that we advised them on. So that would allow them to issue this Bitcoin bond or the volcano bond. And those laws, I think, were passed about 3 or 4 months ago. So they technically can start to do the Bitcoin bond issuance. But I haven't been spending too much time on El Salvador these days. They're already in good hands. Like the Bitfinex guys are very hands on and they're working closely with the government. Also, Max and Stacy are there driving a lot of things day to day. So I've been focusing a lot more of my time on other places to um, educate them about what Bitcoin bonds could do. So, for example, we've talked to the government in Costa Rica about Bitcoin bonds, and that was interesting for them because they have a lot of hydropower. We've spoken with the governor of West Java in Indonesia about Bitcoin bonds too, because Indonesia is very rich in geothermal power, but they also have hydro as well. So they have a lot of opportunity to do a lot of things with Bitcoin. And I think he actually might be the next president or vice president of Indonesia. So again, that time frame of the next 5 years being very crucial. We're engaging with the next heads of state before the heads of state and trying to pave the way and build that foundation with the expectation that something can be done once they are in power.
Most of what you read here or see is negative about El Salvador and everything that they're doing. So when you're meeting with these other world leaders, what's the temperature like with them? Are they looking up to this? This is something that they want to do. They're engaging you in this conversation. They're viewing this as a success because we don't get that story.
Which story? If you read the mainstream media, I think it's actually warming up. If you check some of the coverage on their TradFi bonds, they're being presented in a good light because they've been buying back their debt ahead of schedule. So I think it was the case maybe a year and a half ago where coverage of El Salvador's Bitcoin adoption was very negative, and also the IMF was pushing against it, pushing back against it very heavily too. So I think the tides have turned a bit, and El Salvador is becoming more of a success story in the media. And other countries are definitely looking at it that way too. We get a lot of questions about El Salvador and they want to know more about what happened and how it worked there. We are just relaying that information. And fortunately for Jan 3, our CMO, Edwin Rivas, is Salvadoran, so he can talk from a firsthand perspective about all the policies and what Bitcoin has done for his country. So I think they are looking at it in general as a way for them to figure out what they want to do too. Because El Salvador did everything that you could possibly do with Bitcoin adoption, right? Mining Bitcoin, buying Bitcoin as a treasury asset, Bitcoin law, etc. So other countries may not want to do all of those things or may not be able to do all of those things, but they can definitely do a subset of or at least one of them. And I think actually mining, which we talked about earlier, is very interesting because there is no risk about there's no risk for IMF pushback on that because you're not treading on their toes. You're just encouraging the consumption of energy and the build out of energy infrastructure. And these could be public private partnerships too, which would stimulate the local economy as well. So I think that's a safe bet if you don't want to ruffle their feathers to get into Bitcoin. And it would still be very meaningful because once you have that infrastructure in place and you have companies that enter the market to mine, then you can start to do more. So it's just a foothold in that regard.
Is it more getting them to turn on the mining or is it more to adopt it?
It's all adoption, I think. So if they encourage Bitcoin mining, the rest has to come. So if you take Indonesia as an example, Bitcoin is prohibited by law for being used for payments, but you can't really encourage people to come there and mine Bitcoin unless that is addressed. So I think there's always the tendency where people want to have the perfect solution from day one, but oftentimes that's not really possible. So I would say if they want to encourage mining, we should help them in that regard. Bring the miners in, bring in the big US companies, bring in the ASIC manufacturers, etc. Start that industry. And as that starts to gain traction and it becomes a success story, then we can work on other things like repealing the law that prevents you from spending Bitcoin or carve out a special region where you can spend Bitcoin. But oftentimes, perfect is the enemy of good enough. And we have to take what we have and the opportunities we have as Bitcoiners and not just say, I'm writing off Indonesia because they won't let me spend Bitcoin. Because it's a complicated world and you have to navigate these things in a pragmatic fashion.